Deep in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient sentinels guarding secrets too dark for daylight, a team of government surveyors stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was October 1968, and the autumn mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, masking what lay hidden beneath decades of silence and isolation. The surveyors, led by a man named Robert Fletcher, were mapping uncharted territories for a proposed highway expansion. Their maps showed nothing but wilderness in this particular section of Harlan County, an area so remote that even the most seasoned locals avoided it. The terrain was unforgiving, characterized by steep ridges, dense forests of oak and pine, and narrow creek beds that wound through the landscape like veins carrying the lifeblood of isolation. On the third day of their expedition, as they pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel and rhododendron, Fletcher's boot caught on something metallic. Clearing away decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth, they discovered a rusted iron door built into the hillside, camouflaged so expertly that it had remained invisible to the outside world for generations. The door was locked from the inside, its hinges corroded by time and mountain humidity. What they found inside would become one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation ever documented in American history. The shelter, dug deep into the mountainside, consisted of 4 interconnected rooms carved directly from the earth and rock. The walls were reinforced with timber beams, and a ventilation system, crude but effective, had been engineered to draw fresh air from the surface through a series of narrow shafts disguised as natural rock formations. But it was the inhabitants that stopped Fletcher and his team in their tracks. Huddled in the largest chamber were 7 individuals, their eyes squinting against the unfamiliar brightness of the surveyors' flashlights. These were the Boone siblings, ranging in age from 12 to 37, though their physical appearances made age determination difficult. Their skin was pallid, almost translucent from years without sunlight. Their bodies showed clear signs of genetic complications, physical abnormalities that told a story of successive generations of interbreeding. The eldest, a woman named Sarah Boone, spoke in a dialect so archaic and peculiar that Fletcher initially couldn't understand her. Her speech was a mixture of Elizabethan English and mountain vernacular, preserved in isolation like a linguistic fossil. She explained in halting sentences that they were the descendants of Ezekiel and Martha Boone, siblings who had fled to these mountains in 1887 to escape persecution for their forbidden union. The surveyors discovered journals, dozens of them, meticulously kept by successive generations of Boones. The entries painted a picture of a family that had deliberately chosen isolation over integration, perpetuating their bloodline through sibling unions generation after generation. Ezekiel's first journal entry, dated March 1887, read, "We have found our sanctuary, where judgment cannot reach us, where our love is law, and our children will know freedom from the world's cruel eyes." But freedom came at a terrible cost. The journals documented a progressive deterioration, both physical and mental, across 4 generations. The second generation, born in the early 1900s, showed the first signs of genetic complications. The third generation, documented in journals from the 1920s and 1930s, revealed more severe physical deformities and cognitive impairments. By the 4th generation, the current inhabitants of the shelter, the effects were undeniable and heartbreaking. Among the 7 siblings found in 1968, 3 were deaf, 2 had severe skeletal deformities, and all showed varying degrees of developmental delays. Yet they had survived in their underground world, living off preserved foods, root vegetables they grew, in a small underground garden illuminated by oil lamps, and occasional nocturnal trips to the surface to hunt small game. The most disturbing discovery came when Fletcher's team found the recording device, an old reel-to-reel tape recorder that had been brought into the shelter sometime in the 1950s. On these tapes were hours of recordings, voices from the darkness documenting their daily lives, their beliefs, their justifications, and most chilling of all, their plans to continue the family line. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque essas histórias esquecidas precisam ser contadas, e você não vai querer perder o próximo caso que vai deixar você sem palavras. The tapes began with a voice, strong and defiant, despite the obvious physical strain. It was Marcus Boone, born in 1931, the father of the youngest children found in the shelter. His recording started in 1954, when he had somehow acquired the tape recorder from an abandoned cabin miles away during one of his rare surface expeditions. November 14th, 1954. Marcus's voice crackled through the decades. I speak these words so that our descendants will understand the purity of our purpose. The world above has forgotten the old ways, but we preserve them here, in the bones of the mountain, in the blood of our family. My sister Rebecca and I have been blessed with 3 children. They are perfect in the eyes of our ancestors, regardless of what the ignorant world might say. The recordings revealed a family deeply convinced of their own righteousness. Marcus spoke of his great-grandfather Ezekiel as a prophet, a man who had received divine instruction to preserve the bloodline's purity. He referenced biblical passages, twisted to justify their practices, and spoke of genetic strength rather than weakness, a complete inversion of biological reality. Rebecca's voice appeared on later tapes, softer but equally resolute. Born in 1933, she was Marcus's younger sister and the mother of 4 of the 7 children. Her recordings from 1958 detailed the birth of her daughter Clara, a child who came into the world with complications that Rebecca attributed to the mountain's test of our faith, rather than the consequences of consanguinity. Clara struggles to walk as her brothers do. Rebecca's voice trembled with emotion on one tape. But she has the Boone spirit, the fire that has kept us alive when the world wanted us to disappear. Marcus says her twisted limbs are a mark of distinction, proof that we are different, chosen. I want to believe him. I must believe him, or else what have we done? The tapes documented daily life in excruciating detail. The children's education consisted of reading from the same 6 books that had been brought into the shelter generations ago, including a Bible from 1889, a farmer's almanac from 1902, and several volumes of poetry. They learned mathematics by counting their stored provisions, geography from Marcus's fading memories of the surface world, and history from the journals of their ancestors. Medical care was primitive, and based on folk remedies passed down through generations. When one of the children, a boy named Eli, developed a severe infection in 1962, the tapes captured 3 days of desperate attempts to save him using poultices made from cave moss and roots. Eli survived, but the recordings of his screams, muffled by the earth around them, were among the most difficult for investigators to endure. The tape from December 1965 revealed the family's awareness of their deteriorating situation. Marcus's voice had grown weaker, his breathing labored. The supplies are running low. The youngest ones grow sick more often. Rebecca believes we should send one of the older children to the surface to find help, but I cannot allow it. The moment we expose ourselves, they will tear us apart, study us like animals, destroy everything our family has built. Better to perish with dignity than to be scattered to the world's judgment. But perhaps the most chilling recordings were those of the children themselves. In 1967, Sarah Boone, then 16, made a recording without her parents' knowledge. Her voice was clear, but emotionally fractured. I found Father's journals today, the ones from before we were born. I read about great-great-grandfather Ezekiel and his sister Martha, about how they started this. I read about the children who died, the ones mother and father never speak of, the ones buried in the chamber we're forbidden to enter. There are so many. I counted 23 names, 23 brothers and sisters I never knew. And I wonder, when my time comes to lie with my brother, as mother lies with Uncle Marcus, will my children survive? Will they be among the counted or the forgotten? This recording was followed by silence, then the sound of muffled crying that lasted for 17 minutes before the tape ran out. The investigation that followed the discovery of the Boone shelter became one of the most comprehensive genetic studies of consanguinity ever conducted in the United States. Dr. Helen Morrison, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, led a team that documented the medical and psychological conditions of the 7 surviving siblings. The findings were devastating. All 7 showed evidence of autosomal recessive disorders, conditions that emerge when both parents carry the same defective genes, a near certainty in cases of sibling unions repeated over multiple generations. The eldest, Sarah, suffered from a degenerative muscular condition that made walking painful and would likely confine her to a wheelchair by age 30. Her brother Thomas, aged 28, was profoundly deaf and had a cleft palate that had never been properly treated, leaving his speech nearly incomprehensible to outsiders. The medical examinations revealed even more disturbing patterns. DNA analysis, still in its early stages in 1968, suggested that the genetic diversity within the Boone family had collapsed to levels comparable to highly inbred laboratory animals. Dr. Morrison's report noted, "The coefficient of inbreeding in this family exceeds any previously documented human case. The probability of genetic abnormalities in any offspring would approach certainty." But the physical toll was only part of the story. Psychological evaluations conducted over 6 months revealed a family living in a reality fundamentally disconnected from the outside world. The children had been taught that they were special, chosen, superior in their purity. The revelation that the world viewed their family structure as wrong, harmful, and criminal shattered their entire worldview. Marcus Boone, interviewed by psychiatrist Dr. Raymond Cole in January 1969, remained defiant even as his health rapidly declined. "You call us damaged," he said, his voice recorded in the interview transcripts. "But we survived, 4 generations in the earth, and we survived. That's more than the weak surface dwellers could claim. Every child born in our family was wanted, loved, raised with purpose. Can the world above say the same?" When Dr. Cole explained the genetic realities, the medical facts about why sibling unions produce such devastating results, Marcus simply shook his head. "Science is the world's way of explaining what it fears. Our family proves that love and determination conquer all obstacles. Yes, some children were weaker, some didn't survive, but the strong ones carried on. That's nature's way, that's God's way." Rebecca's psychological state was more fragile. During her sessions with Dr. Cole, she oscillated between defending her family's choices and expressing deep guilt about her children's suffering. In one particularly emotional session, she broke down completely. "I see my daughter Clara struggling to breathe at night, her chest so deformed that every breath is a battle, and I tell myself it's God's will. But then I dream of the outside world, of doctors who might have helped her, of a life she could have had if I had been braver, if I had chosen differently. But how could I? This is all I've ever known. This is all Marcus ever showed me." The younger siblings struggled with a different crisis: identity. Raised to believe they were special, they now faced a world that viewed them with a mixture of pity, disgust, and scientific curiosity. Sarah's journal, started after the discovery, captured this conflict. They want us to denounce our parents, to say we were hurt, but how can I? They loved us the only way they knew. They thought they were protecting us. The cruelty wasn't in their intentions, it was in their blindness, in their absolute certainty that they were right, when every cell in our bodies screams that they were wrong. The community's response was equally complex. Some local residents expressed sympathy, viewing the Boones as victims of their ancestors' choices. Others felt only revulsion, demanding that the surviving family members be institutionalized or sterilized to prevent any possibility of continuing the bloodline. Town hall meetings in Harlan County became heated forums where the ethics of intervention, freedom, and protection were debated with passionate intensity. At this strategic moment, I want you to think about Sarah's words, about the weight of a legacy you never chose. Leave a comment with this phrase: some legacies aren't gifts, they're curses we're born into. As investigators delved deeper into the shelter, they discovered that the 4 main chambers were not the full extent of the Boone family's underground world. Behind a concealed door in the largest room, hidden beneath a false floor, they found a 5th chamber that the surviving siblings had been forbidden to enter. This chamber was a crypt of sorts, but its purpose was more complex than simple burial. The walls were lined with small alcoves, each containing the remains of a child, carefully wrapped in cloth and preserved in the cool, dry environment. Beside each body was a jar containing a handwritten note describing the child's brief life, their parentage, and the genetic complications that had led to their death. The earliest burial dated to 1891, just 4 years after Ezekiel and Martha had entered the mountains. The note read, "Our son Jeremiah, born February 1891, returned to the Lord March 1891. His heart was too weak for this world, but his spirit was pure. The first fruit of our union, the first sacrifice to our faith." There were 43 bodies in total, spanning 4 generations. The notes documented a horrifying pattern: infant mortality rates above 70%, with most children dying before their first birthday from heart defects, respiratory failures, or complications too severe for their primitive medical knowledge to address. Those who survived infancy often didn't reach adulthood, succumbing to the cumulative effects of genetic damage. One particularly heartbreaking series of notes came from the 1920s, written by Ezekiel's daughter Hannah and her brother-husband Samuel. They had attempted to have children 6 times. 5 of those children were in the crypt. The notes grew progressively more desperate. Our daughter Ruth, born April 1923, joined her sister in God's garden June 1923. Her body rejected sustenance. We tried everything. Our son Abel, born November 1924, could not draw breath. He fought for 3 days. Samuel held him until the end. Our daughter Leah, born August 1926, seemed strong at first. We had hope. She lived 7 months before the seizures took her. I cannot bear this anymore. The final note in Hannah's handwriting was brief. Our son Marcus, born May 1931, lives. After so much death, life, we will protect him, teach him, ensure our family continues through him. He is our redemption. Marcus was the same man whose voice dominated the tapes, the father of the children found in 1968. The weight of being the sole survivor of his generation had shaped his entire worldview, convincing him that his survival proved the family's righteousness rather than revealing the terrible cost of their choices. The crypt also contained journals that hadn't been in the main chambers, personal writings too painful or too revealing to share with the surviving children. These journals exposed the full psychological toll of the family's isolation. Martha's later entries, written in the 1920s before her death, showed a woman consumed by regret. Ezekiel died believing we had created paradise, but I see it for what it is now, a tomb we built with our own hands, consecrated with the blood of our children. I thought love could conquer judgment, that our bond was stronger than the world's rules. But rules exist for reasons written in our very flesh. I have buried 23 grandchildren. I have watched my remaining children's bodies betray them, and still they believe. Still they continue. I tried to tell them, tried to make them see, but Ezekiel's words are carved deeper in their hearts than any truth I could speak. I will die here, and they will continue, and more children will fill these alcoves, and no one will ever know or care. The discovery of the crypt forced a re-evaluation of the entire case. What had initially seemed like a family that had merely isolated themselves now appeared as something far darker. A multi-generational cycle of harm perpetuated through a combination of ideology, isolation, and the human capacity for self-deception in the face of overwhelming evidence. Dr. Morrison's expanded report included analysis of the remains in the crypt. The genetic defects were severe and would have been immediately apparent to any outside observer. These children never had a chance, her report stated. The combination of genetic factors made survival exceptional rather than expected. The fact that 7 individuals lived to the ages we found them is statistically improbable. But this does not represent triumph. It represents the 7 who survived out of potentially 50 attempts, a success rate that any objective observer would recognize as catastrophic failure. Orishisu, the Boone siblings, were removed from the shelter in November 1968 and placed in various care facilities across Kentucky. The transition was traumatic for all of them. Sarah, the most articulate of the group, described it in her continued journal entries. They took us from the only home we knew and put us in buildings that smell of chemicals and sadness. They say they're helping us, but they look at us like we're broken things that need fixing. Maybe we are. Maybe we always were, and we just couldn't see it in the darkness. Marcus Boone died in March 1969, just 5 months after being brought to the surface. The official cause was pneumonia, but the attending physicians noted that he seemed to lose the will to live once separated from the shelter and his family. His final words, recorded by a nurse, were, "I failed them, not by what I did, but by believing I was right to do it. Take me back to the mountain. Let me rest with the others." Rebecca survived until 1973, living in a state-run facility where she received treatment for her various medical conditions. She never fully adapted to the outside world, spending her days writing letters to her children, many of which went unanswered, as the siblings struggled with their own complicated feelings about their parents. She died quietly in her sleep, and her final journal, found beside her bed, contained a single repeated phrase written hundreds of times. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The 7 siblings had vastly different outcomes. Sarah, despite her physical limitations, proved to have a sharp intellect. With intensive education, she eventually earned a GED and became an advocate for victims of familial harm, though she never spoke publicly about her own experiences. She gave one interview in 1985 on condition of anonymity, where she said, "People want to know if I hate my parents. I don't. I pity them. They were as much victims of this cycle as we were, maybe more so, because they had the power to break it and chose not to. Every day I live with the consequences of their choices, but I refuse to let those consequences define my entire existence." Thomas and Clara, the siblings with the most severe physical complications, remained in assisted living facilities for the rest of their lives. Thomas died in 1991 at age 51 from heart failure, a condition exacerbated by his genetic background. Clara survived until 2003, becoming, ironically, the longest-lived member of her generation, despite being the most physically affected. She never learned to speak clearly enough for most people to understand, but she communicated through written notes and became known among the facility staff for her gentle disposition and love of flowers, which she tended in the facility's garden. The younger siblings, those who had been children when discovered, had somewhat better outcomes with intensive intervention. Two of them, after years of therapy and education, managed to live semi-independently with support services. They changed their names, moved to different states, and attempted to build lives separate from their family history. One became a janitor at a school, finding peace in the simple routine of his work. The other worked in a library surrounded by books, finally able to learn about the world that had been hidden from him. The shelter itself was sealed in 1970 after all useful evidence had been collected. The local authorities debated what to do with it, ultimately deciding that turning it into any kind of memorial would be inappropriate. The entrance was collapsed, and the location was deliberately removed from maps. Nature reclaimed the site, and within a decade, no visible trace remained of the Boone family's underground world. The tapes and journals were archived at the University of Kentucky's Medical Library, available only to researchers with specific credentials and legitimate academic purposes. They became the foundation for numerous studies on the genetic, psychological, and sociological effects of extreme consanguinity and isolation. Dr. Morrison published a comprehensive analysis in 1975 that became a standard reference in genetics textbooks, though the family was given a pseudonym to protect the surviving siblings' privacy. In the following decades, the Boone case influenced policy changes regarding child welfare, mandatory education, and intervention in isolated communities. It became a case study in medical ethics courses, raising questions about when society has the right or obligation to intervene in family structures, even those maintained by seemingly willing participants. The last surviving sibling, whose identity remains protected, gave a final statement to researchers in 2018, exactly 50 years after the shelter's discovery. Now in her 60s, she reflected on her life. I've had 5 decades to process what happened, to understand the scientific and ethical dimensions of my family's choices. I've read the studies, seen the genetic charts, understood the probability calculations that explain why so many of my siblings died. But knowledge doesn't erase experience. I still remember my mother's voice singing lullabies in the darkness, my father's rough hands teaching me to read by lamplight, the feeling of safety I had in those earthen rooms before I knew enough to understand what had been taken from me. The tragedy isn't just what they did to us, it's that they genuinely believed they were protecting us, loving us, doing right by us. That's what makes it unbearable, not malice, but misguided love taken to its most destructive extreme. The tapes they found changed everything, not just for the Boone siblings, but for how we understand the intersection of isolation, ideology, and the human capacity for both survival and self-destruction. The story of the Boones remains a stark reminder that some family legacies, no matter how deeply rooted in conviction, are built on foundations that cannot and should not sustain life. If you made it to the end of this deeply disturbing true story, you understand why these forgotten cases matter. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you never miss the next investigation into the darkest corners of hidden history. If you watched until here, it's because you connected with this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all," so I can know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if this story impacted you, and share it with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural. They're the choices people make when isolated from truth. The Boone siblings' shelter may be sealed forever, but their story must never be forgotten.